and welcome to our first session today. Yesterday, there was a lot of discussion about generalities about adaptation. Today, in today's plenary, and also in the parallel sessions, we're going to get down to the details and explore adaptation in specific sectors and systems. And we have a very nice panel to start the day's conversations and frame some of these issues. We'll start with Keith Alverson. I'll go through all the presenters. Keith Alverson, who's in charge of adaptation terrestrial ecosystems at UNEP, who's going to talk about global adaptation networks like this one. Next, we'll hear from Jupal Chowdhury on adaptation action in the mountains. He'll talk about his own experience from ECMOD, but also, since they're well connected to other groups, he'll talk about perspectives at different levels and especially local level adaptation planning. And finally, we'll hear from Yusuf Nassif of the UNFCCC, who will talk about the transition into a holistic international approach to adaptation at the UNFCCC. So, Keith, can you share your thoughts?
Thank you, Eric.
As you know, global carbon dioxide levels have risen in 2011 to record highs. This is the report that came out from the International Energy Agency in May of 2012, indicating that carbon dioxide emissions had risen yet again to a new record to 31.6 billion tons. And this is despite the fact that both Europe and the United States had decreased their emissions. Although the final data is not yet available, we will soon learn from IAEA in 2013 that 2012 was again a record high. So let me start with a couple of slides. These are from the United States, but nonetheless true, I think, for many countries. Last year, Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, and rough estimate of the damage that it caused is provided by the amount of funds that the federal government made available to New York as aid after the fact to clean up the mess, basically. That's more than $50 billion for that one event. And you can see that the governor of New York has taken some of that money, a rather small percentage at $400 million, but still a rather large number when we compare it to the amount of money we generally have to carry out adaptation work. $400 million to purchase homes along the shore of New York that had been wrecked by the hurricane, demolish them, and preserve the flood-prone land permanently as a barrier against similar events in the future through natural or ecosystem-based approach to coastal protection. It's not just New York, of course, that's feeling the brunt of climate change. Sorry about the PowerPoint. I didn't construct this very well. The same issue of the New York Times that I took that last quote from showed the record taxpayer cost in the United States for crop insurance due to the drought last year in the central U.S. $16 billion in crop insurance losses in 2012 due to drought. And the rather sobering headline only a month later that the very low snowpack in the West might signal a second year of drought, an extended period of drought, and perhaps even greater losses this coming 2013 season. So this is simply to show you that the numbers in terms of the impacts of climate change can be quite large, even though we often hear the mantra that least developed countries are the most vulnerable and that adaptation is a development challenge. We can see quite clearly that development in and of itself is not the solution to ending your vulnerability to climate change, because one of the most developed countries in the world here suffered, well, just from these two events, more than $60 billion in losses last year. So what is UNEP trying to do about this problem? Roughly four bullets here that sort of oversee our programs in adaptation, and I'll speak about the first three. First is supporting global networks, of which this APAN community is one of the very strong regional pillars. Also putting in place ecosystem-based measures to help develop resilience to climate change, such as the one that I just showed you from Governor Cuomo in New York, but doing that around the world in developing countries and least developed countries. And assisting with access to adaptation finance. There was a parallel session on this yesterday, so I'll go rather quickly through it. Finally, supporting the research community through support for the Provia program. You've heard about that, I think, already from Salim Hook in this meeting, and I won't be speaking about that in great detail. So the network, the Global Adaptation Network. I'm not going to dwell too long on this because we're all quite familiar with networks, being here at the APAN meeting, but it's about bringing together practitioners, people putting adaptation projects on the ground, policymakers who are trying to use the examples that have been shown to develop policy and mainstream adaptation into government works, and the academic research community. Communities that are being affected by climate change, and bringing together this knowledge to share best practices and avoid maladaptation. APAN is one of several regional networks that we're supporting. Perhaps one of the first to really get started and to show such a vibrant community as we have here at this meeting these days here in Incheon. We also have a regional program in Latin America and the Caribbean, Regatta, and the coordinator of that out of our Panama office is here at this meeting. And recently kickstarted the Africa Adaptation Knowledge Network, and again, the coordinator of that network is here at the meeting today. Some future challenges for these networks. One is linking with the Climate Technology Center and network that has been endorsed by the UNFCCC in Doha, trying to ensure that our adaptation community can ensure that there's a strong adaptation technology component in those center networks. This is being led by UNEP, so it's something relatively easy since it's in-house for us at UNEP, but nonetheless making it a more global effort and ensuring adaptation component is a high priority for us. And the second is working together with the UNFCCC. Yusuf Nasser is here giving another talk in this session, and we'll perhaps speak more about the UNFCCC plans, but we're trying to ensure that our knowledge networks feed in from the bottom, and the UNFCCC can give us support and help ensure that our network activities are recognized at a global level and taken up by countries, parties to the convention. So I like to show this slide because it gives a little sense of what ecosystem-based adaptation is on a very concrete level. For those of you who were in Durban at the COP17, you might have taken a walk down the promenade, protecting or in front of the city there in Durban. And I'll just read off here the bullet points for those of you who maybe can't see the screen as well. Benefits of dune vegetation. Contributes towards an attractive environment. Reduces the impacts of wind-blown sand, provides a habitat for birds, reptiles, insects, and animals, promotes biodiversity. And then as a last bullet point, almost an afterthought, provides some protection against sea surges and erosion. So here's a case where one municipality has put in place an ecosystem-based dune vegetation project along its waterfront. For many reasons, for multiple benefits to the local community and to visitors there, only one of which is adaptation to sea level rise, reducing their vulnerability to climate change induced global sea level rise. And often we find that for all of our adaptation projects, particularly those that use this ecosystem-based approach, it's important to demonstrate those local multiple benefits in order to ensure sustainability of your action. In many cases, the ecosystem, the threat that we face from climate change is not uniquely due to climate change. So here I'm showing the coral reef, barrier reef in Australia. It's threatened by many things. Warming of the waters is one, but also acidification. Agricultural runoff, particularly nutrients from the agricultural zones in Australia. Fishing, tourism, these are all threatening the reef. At the same time, protecting the reef and using its ecosystem based ability to grow as sea level rises and protect the coast provides climate resilience, but at the same time provides multiple other benefits, as I mentioned in the other slide, for all of these sectors. Tourism, fishing, again, it's a benefit, a way of looking at it as benefits rather than threats. UNEP has put in place the decision support framework, which we are testing out in all of our ecosystem-based projects, which is kind of a moving from the principles, the ideas of ecosystem-based approaches to demonstrating it on the ground and thinking sort of a flowchart approach is how you can best integrate ecosystem-based approaches within a broader effort to adapt to climate change. So this is a practitioner's manual, basically, that we share with all of our projects in adaptation and try to encourage ecosystem-based components thereof. Now, in the rest of the parallel sessions today, we're going to be seeing a number of sectors, different mountains and rivers and so forth. So I just wanted to give you a brief sense at UNEP of the kind of bilateral ecosystem-based projects we have going in these regions. We have a strong program in mountain regions where we're demonstrating ecosystem-based approaches in 3 different countries and 3 continents, Uganda, Peru, and Nepal. This is together with some partners, fairly substantial funding from Germany. I'll let you read the details. We have another large project in the Nile Basin. This is a regional effort, so trying to look at water stress in the Nile Basin region with all of the riparian countries of the Nile, so 14 African countries involved in sharing their data to look at future water stress scenarios and how these might be impacted by, for example, hydroelectric dam building and so forth. A third is in the coastal regions and small island developing states funded by the European Commission. We're starting that project just now with a couple of target example countries, Seychelles and Grenada, but also sort of a broader learning, best practice learning component for SIDS more broadly. So that's what we have in place now, already funded, already started up. A couple of other projects. You notice from those first 3 that the mountains and small island developing states are relatively remote from where many people live. And so one of the potential criticisms of ecosystem-based approaches has always been, well, these ecosystems are nice, but what about all the vulnerable people? A lot of them live elsewhere. So we've got some seed funding, and we're trying to develop ecosystem-based approaches in some more heavily populated areas where we can really demonstrate the benefits to people. And the 2 we've chosen to get started with is first is in the smallholder agricultural-dominated landscapes of Africa, where there's great vulnerability and many, many people living and depending on ecosystem services for adaptation and food security. And the second is in the peri-urban areas of cities in Asia that are growing very quickly into their peri-urban areas and maybe have some choices to make about how they develop into these areas and whether they preserve ecosystem services for adaptation and other benefits or develop them in other ways. So both of those have recently started with a small amount of a few $100,000 in seed funding, and we're seeking larger support from countries and multilateral sources. We have a large portfolio of adaptation projects around the world funded through a number of different sources. I'm going to show you the portfolio from these 3, the Least Developed Countries Fund, Special Climate Change Fund, and the Adaptation Fund, those countries that choose to use indirect access, working with UNEP as an implementing agency. So here on the map on the stars, you see the countries that we're active in that portfolio. Obviously dominated by least developed countries because of the nature of these sources of multilateral funding, which for the most part account for the fact that the entire American continent has no stars on it. Roughly speaking, about 2/3 of this portfolio is funded through the Least Developed Countries Fund. One Special Climate Change Fund proposal is currently under implementation, and 3 Adaptation Fund projects. So this is about $50 million portfolio that's in place, and we have in the pipeline roughly the same amount for future work. UNEP has a wide variety of publications, and I brought all of these publications with me today. So those of you who are interested, I'd encourage you to come up to me afterwards and get a copy, outlining our work in ecosystem-based adaptation. Some of these are policy briefs, which I've handed out to ministers and heads of delegation at the UNFCCC to try and encourage national engagement with ecosystem-based approaches. Some of them are about our networks. Some of them are about specific projects like the ones in mountains and so forth. We have a number of upcoming events of interest. First of all, I should mention just this week and next week in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, both the UNFCCC and the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, are running ecosystem-based adaptation technical workshops. It's interesting to see this linkage between these two conventions, which really highlights the multiple benefits of this kind of approach, delivering for both biodiversity wins and climate change adaptation wins. We're supporting the community-based adaptation meeting in Bangladesh in April. You see the dates there. Salim Hook is hosting that meeting. This is an attempt really to demonstrate how ecosystem-based approaches can be applied at the community level, and how it's not either community-based or ecosystem-based, but that in fact ecosystem-based mechanisms for adapting to climate change can be applied at any level. They can be applied regionally, for example, our Nile Basin project. They can be applied at the national level through the UNFCCC and its parties, and they can be applied at the community level, where a concerned community can address its vulnerability to climate change through preserving its ecosystem services locally. Finally, alongside the SBSTA talks, UNFCCC SBSTA talks in Bonn, we have a couple of events. We're running a session at the ICLEI Resilient Cities meeting to highlight our new peri-urban work in Asia, and running Adaptation Knowledge Day there for, I think, the 4th year in a row now, together with partners. Looking ahead, some of our challenges. Together with UNDP, we have about $6 million in funding from the Global Environment Fund for global NAP support, National Adaptation Programs. And also we're in the early stages of developing a Green Climate Fund Readiness Support Program. I didn't mention it in my talk, but we have a strong program in support for countries that wish to obtain funding through direct access. So we assist countries in achieving accreditation with the Adaptation Fund today, and we're looking forward to working with countries interested in that kind of support for the GCF once it becomes operational here in Incheon, together with UNDP. A second one is ensuring uptake by these multilateral financing agencies such as the GEF, and also countries through the parties to the UNFCCC, that they take up this idea of ecosystem-based approaches, focusing on areas where there are a lot of vulnerable people. And third, and I think Youssef will talk about this, I hope, in his talk as well, is this link I mentioned between the Climate Technology Network and Center, as well as the Adaptation Committee at the UNFCCC, to try and bring the work that we've been building up through groups like APAN and DAGATA and through the Global Adaptation Network to a support for the UNFCCC's Adaptation Committee and their need to develop a knowledge platform there. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We're going to hear from each of the speakers and then have general questions. But are there any clarification questions at this point? Okay, thank you. So next, we'll hear from Jupal Chowdhury talking about adaptation in mountain regions.
Let me begin by expressing our appreciation and gratitude to the organizers for giving us this forum to talk about mountains and what is happening in the mountains in terms of adaptation. The International Center for Integrated Mountain Development is a center which looks at the mountains, working for the mountain people. So I take just a few minutes to talk about the center and then get into